I've always been interested in writing. When I was little, I always was writing stories and things like that. And I think I've got quite a vivid imagination, or so that's what my parents have always told me. And one day I was in the airport, this would have been in 2017 or 18, and I saw a poster for a sloth. And I just, for some reason, I just thought it would be funny to have a children's book that had a sloth that was quick or speedy, because that's very opposite to what a sloth normally is. And suddenly, while I was on the plane, I obviously didn't really have anything to do because you can't use your phone or anything like that on the plane. The first line of my book just sort of flashed into my mind about this Speedy Sloth. And, in the rainforests of South America deep lives a curious creature most often asleep. And that just sort of, the rhyme just sort of banged straight into my head. And I thought, well, I've got to write this down. So I got out my phone, obviously on aeroplane mode, and just wrote down, and it just sort of started coming out. And then I wrote probably 60, 70%, something like that on the flight. And then I sort of tightened it up. And
Okay, I love this. So first of all, airplanes, great place for productivity. You're just trapped. You can't move anywhere. There's no internet. Some of my most productive writing time happens on airplanes. You draft the thing, most of it on the flight. You start shopping around for traditional publishers and you get rejected, or do you go straight to the self-publishing path?
No, I did go down the traditional publishing route because, I think because that's just the idea people have in their minds. I suppose when you think of the really famous authors, most of them are traditionally published, or at least the ones that the ones that I knew. But also, I think it was also a cost thing, because obviously a traditional publisher would usually do all of the illustrations and pay for all the marketing, and they basically do most of it for you. So I did go down that route, but I unfortunately didn't get anywhere with it. I then explored the self-publishing route, and that's when I decided that was what I was going to do.
Yeah, this is the problem, because I've got at least 2 children's books in my head, but the problem is I'm not far from it, being a qualified illustrator to turn this thing into reality. Because my kids, they're 3 and 5, they look, whenever I'm reading a book, an adult book, a grown-up book, they look at it and say, does it have any pictures? And then they're like immediately bored with it. It's like, there's no pictures here. It's a book with no pictures. We're out. What was the process like for finding somebody to draw it? Or did you draw it yourself, to illustrate it yourself?
No, unfortunately, I'm not artistically inclined in that way. So no, I can't draw. I knew from the start I wouldn't be illustrating it. So what I did was I actually discovered, I'd never used it before, but I discovered Fiverr.com, which people probably are familiar with. It's a marketplace for freelance services, and it's relatively low cost most of the time. And I started looking around and looked at people's, the different freelancers that offered illustrations, and checked out their profiles, looked at some of their work. Obviously, I had an idea in my head of what I wanted the illustrations to be like, in terms of, I quite like the traditional watercolor style, hand-drawn. So I chose an illustrator who did that for my first book, which was Sam the Speedy Sloth. And I had done a book before that, which I had actually illustrated using sort of stock images on canva.com. But that was a slightly different book. That was my first ever book. It was called Go On, Press It. And it had a big red button on the front. And it said, every page says, do this action, like knock on the door. And then the next page shows what the reaction is. So someone opening the door or pressing the button, and that causes a rocket ship to blast off or whatever. So I did that all using effectively, I guess, clip art, sort of, like a nicer version of clip art. But for the Sam the Speedy Sloth, I wanted to really fully illustrate it and have it done professionally.
I mean, I just like this idea of doing this Canva, kind of this interactive book. We've got a few of those too. It's like push the button, shake the book up and down, see what happens on the next page. Kids are definitely into that. That's a creative way to get it done. Now, for your Fiverr illustrator, did you say, okay, I need 40 pages? Was it, can I get a sample of your work? Like, what was the initial outreach or interaction like?
So I did one illustration as a test. So that's what I would recommend people do that with most services, especially if you're committing to quite a big order. I got her to do one illustration for me just to test out what it was like, what her services were going to be like. I wanted to make sure we could work together and the language barrier wasn't going to become a difficulty. But it was fine. She's really good. she pretty much got it nail on the head each time. I sort of told her what I wanted each illustration to look like, and then she just brought that to life. I think with writing children's books, often, even if you're not the illustrator, you still have to come up with effectively a storyboard in your mind. Some illustrators might do that themselves, but for me, I wanted it to be my vision. So I came up with, I sort of said, in this image, I want the sloth to be doing this thing. I want, these in the background. I want, and I told her basically what I wanted exactly to be like. And then she just took my words, my description, and made it into an illustration.